Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this very important event, yarning about truth-telling reconciliation with Professor Henry Reynolds. My name is Marcelle Burns. I'm a Gomeroi woman and lecturer in the School of Law at UNE, and also a member of the Armidale Friends of Mile Creek Committee. So this event today is a collaboration between UNE School of Law, the Arala Aboriginal Centre and the Friends of Mile Creek Memorial. So I'd just like to welcome you here on behalf of those respective groups. But before we go any further, I'd like to invite Uncle Steve Witters, Anawan Elder, and also a friend of Mile Creek to do a welcome to country for us today.
How's that? Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, Marcelle. Steve Witters is my name, as Marcelle pointed out. A friend of Mile Creek Armidale branch and supporter of the commemoration ceremony and the whole concept of it. And also as a descendant of the Werraway people as well, the people that were involved in the massacre which took place on the 10th of January. 10th of June, rather, 1838. So I'm here in that capacity, but also as a descendant of the Anawan people and the Kamilaroi from around Terry Hi and Moree, where the Werraway people were living at the time, and from Anawan as well. As you all know, a welcome to country is given in the true spirit of friendship and goodwill. And it's given as Aboriginal people travel from one country to another without leaving this country. I always say that Aboriginal people made this nation multicultural. We were multicultural before any white man came here. And a welcome was done because people spoke different languages and different customs. They lived according to their land. The land was part of their identity, with all the topography and geography and all the animals and the environment and the land that was all around them that defined them. And when they went somewhere else, they were to be welcomed to the country and state their purpose while they was there. And it was often given in that spirit of cooperation and goodwill and understanding and friendship. So Aboriginal people had it right. They had it right for thousands of years. Then all things changed. But today I'm here to welcome you all. Not only our small crowd here in the small but very warm crowd, I might say, in Armidale, here in Arala, but those of us that are online. And I found out the other day what a webinar is. It's a seminar via the web. Well, that's what I'm guessing anyway. So hello to all of you people online who are tuned into us, and certainly to Professor Henry Reynolds down in Tasmania, which is Henry, I know, and most of us here would know too, Tasmania's got it's a beautiful part of the country, but the story down there is not so beautiful either. It's probably one of the most brutal places in Australia when it comes to things like this. But we all know that, and if we don't, we will learn it today. And I feel like all of us here, understand the need for truth to be told. And I think one person who is very supportive of that, and I know who's an advocate about it, and is very vocal about it, is our guest today, Professor Henry Reynolds from Tasmania, and that's why we're all here tuned in. But welcome to you all. In that spirit that we talked about, understanding and creating a bit more information and knowledge, as our elders and our communities have done for thousands of years. They've been resilient people. They've been patient people. They've been cooperative people. And they've been strong people. And they've survived because of all of that. And they've been respectful people as well. They've always been open and always been transparent in every dealing that they have. And the idea about sitting around in a circle where everybody could see each other and, discuss openly the truth about what was going on in their communities showed that the truth is the best thing. Truth was the best policy. So it's not a new thing. It's been around for thousands of years as far as Aboriginal people go. And I myself feel that the way as a nation, the only way forward as a nation for all of us is to know the truth, to understand the truth. To understand the present, we have to understand the past. And many of our fellow Australians here, and people overseas as well, do not understand where we are today because they don't understand the past. It's as simple as that. Aboriginal people knew it all the time because they dealt with it and discussed it all the time. So today's lecturer, not lecturer, I'm saying that, Professor, because we're in a lecture room, but I know we're not going to get a lecture. I think it's more about dialogue today rather than monologue. So it's something that we've all got an interest in, particularly me, but that's not diminishing all of everything else. We're all here for the same reason. The truth needs to be told about this country. And Professor Reynolds, I know you may even mention it. We're often told by media that the worst massacre that ever happened was one in Tasmania, Port Augusta. Recent one, 25 years ago. Sorry, not Port Augusta, Port Arthur. Having the states mixed up there for a moment. We're told that by the media, that the Port Arthur massacre was the worst one that's ever happened in Australia. Now, I don't want to diminish any consequences about that, and I have complete empathy and condolence and respect for the people that are involved in that. But the truth needs to be told that it's not the worst one. And in fact, there's hundreds, if not thousands of other ones that have happened all over this country. And we don't hear about that in the true history and the true teachings of this, well, maybe not so true, of this land. Truth-telling is a big thing if we're going to move forward and if we're going to understand ourselves and our identity as Australians. It really needs to be told. And another thing, and I know, Professor Reynolds, I'm not trying to take this all off you, but the stuff about the stories about the native wars. Now, I've lost the speech, but we commemorate things like we're doing at Myall Creek over the weekend, commemorating the massacre there, not necessarily celebrating it, but commemorating it. And making sure that people do remember and do understand that this is part of the true history of this country. And the frontier wars and the native wars, they need to be honoured and commemorated as well. I know we get out at Anzac Day and commemorate the soldiers that left this country to fight for the Commonwealth, fight for another country overseas. But we never give mention to the warriors and their families that died defending this country. There's a lot of blood on the wattle here, and that truth needs to be told too, as Australians, and as part of the international community too. Because we often say that Australia is the best place to live in, but don't know the true story, don't know the full story, and the real story about Australia. Anyway, welcome everybody. Welcome here to the annual lecture, which is, I'm saying lecture again, to the annual discussion and dialogue and learning experience, particularly those online, wherever you may be. I'm not sure, I think there's over 100 people online and others, maybe since the registration's closed. But welcome here for this very important and significant discussion. I'll say Dunga Nadaga, that's hello. I should have said that at the beginning, but Agalana Bura, that's goodbye, and feel safe and welcome. Thank you. Bye.
Okay, so thank you very much, Uncle Stephen, for your welcome to country. I'd just also like to note before we start yarning with Professor Reynolds that we have apologies today from the Vice-Chancellor and CEO of the University of New England, Professor Bridget Hayward, the Chancellor, Mr James Harris, and the Friends of Mile Creek National Committee co-chairs Ivan Roberts and Keith Munro, Dr Anne Daly, the public officer as well. So our speaker today needs very little introduction, but I'll just outline some of his amazing achievements as a scholar. Professor Henry Reynold is a leading Australian historian whose pioneering work has shed light on the history of relations between settlers and First Peoples in Australia. Among his best-known books are The Other Side of the Frontier, The Law of the Land, The Whispering in Our Hearts, Fate of a Free People, Why Weren't We Told, North of Capricorn, Forgotten War, and Drawing the Global Colour Line, co-authored with Marilyn Lake. He has presented numerous public lectures and talks throughout Australia, Britain, New Zealand and Canada. His work has been awarded many literary prizes, including the Prime Minister's Prize for Non-Fiction, the Queensland Premier's Prize, the Human Rights Commission Prize for Literature, and the Victorian Premier's Prize for Non-Fiction. Professor Reynolds also holds honorary doctorates from the University of Tasmania and James Cook University, and one I particularly like, was elected a National Living Treasure in 1998. He's been elected to the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies, the Australian Academy of the Humanities, the Australian Academy of Social Sciences, and he's received numerous other awards. He's also, being a lawyer, I have to note this, been a consultant to the legal team in the case of the Wick Peoples before the High Court of Australia in 1995-96, and a consultant to the three-part documentary produced by the ABC Frontier, and also a consultant to the Canadian Royal Commission on Indigenous Rights. His latest book, Truth-Telling, History, Sovereignty and the Uluru Statement, argues that the weight of history and law provides support for the Uluru Statement as a way forward for the proper recognition of First Nations peoples in this country. And that's primarily what we'll be talking about today. But before we go into that, I'd just like to do some housekeeping matters. We'll be having a yarn. I'll be asking some questions with Professor Reynolds for about 40 minutes, then we'll open it up to the audience in the room here and also online for some Q&A with Professor Reynolds. And Andrew Lawson over here will be fielding the Q&A questions from the online group. I think most people would have seen their way to the bathrooms on the way in here, pardon me, but if you need to go out this door to the left and then through the glass doors, and the bathrooms are just there. Okay, so without any further ado, I'd like to start yarning with Professor Reynolds. So thank you very much for joining us today, Professor Reynolds. It's a great honour and privilege to be able to speak with you today. So thank you, and we know you're down there in Tasmania where it's very chilly, and we're experiencing similar weather up here at the moment. But my first question for you is, you have devoted your academic career to truth-telling and exposing the history of frontier conflict, and also interrogating the legal doctrines that have supported the colonial invasion of Aboriginal lands by the British. In your book, you say you've been accused of disloyalty, irresponsible troublemaking, of hating your country, and have been denounced as a communist and ratbag. How do you feel about that?
Well, when it comes from people who you don't respect, you would be worried if they didn't attack you. I always expected that this would be the case, partly because when I started doing this work in North Queensland 50 years ago, when really and truly the north of Australia was still a colonial frontier in the worst possible sense. And the violence of the frontier was much closer in time. It also, this was a society which experienced a lot of conflict, a lot of racial conflict, almost daily at that stage. This was in the 1960s. Now, if you go into a place like this and start telling them that you have to come to terms with your history, and the history you've been taught is if not exactly wrong, at least very one-sided, you are bound to create opposition. Now, I'd known this really come as a surprise when this continued, because what I was saying was shocking to many people, and I understood that. My generation had grown up with a very, very, a sunlit, peaceful story about Australia, about pioneers and their struggle with the land, with distance and drought and flooding rains and bushfire. This was an heroic story. Now, as a young person that I once was, as a young person, I came along and said, "You're wrong. You've got the history wrong." Now, people were inclined to learn their history when they're young, usually at school, and they keep that history with them. And so I was turning up and saying, "You've got to totally rethink the story of Australia." Now, that was a disturbing thing, and so I'm not surprised that people found that troubling. And in the 1960s, the response literally was that we were communists. This was true of Margaret and me, and true of Eddie Mabo, and true of all the people involved in that early period of agitation. The assumption was that we were simply, if not actual members of the party, then simply tools of the Communist Party. And there was an active Communist Party in North Queensland in those days. So, yes, there was a lot of opposition. And in a way, living in the North prepared me for the sort of response I would get when I started publishing books and writing articles for the national papers and going on radio and television.
Thank you. Okay, so now turning to your book and the Uluru Statement from the Heart. So the Uluru Statement from the Heart is a plea from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples for substantive constitutional change and structural reform so that First Peoples can take our rightful place in our own country. And the statement addresses three key areas of reform: a First Nations voice to the Parliament enshrined in the Constitution, and the establishment of a Makarrata Commission to oversee truth-telling and agreement-making with First Peoples. So the statement talks about the enduring sovereignty of First Nations as coexisting with the sovereignty of the Australian nation state. And it says, our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander tribes were the first sovereign nations of the Australian continent and its adjacent islands, possessed under our own laws and customs. This our ancestors did according to the reckoning of our culture from the creation, according to the common law from time immemorial, and according to science more than 60,000 years. This sovereignty has never been ceded or extinguished and coexists with the sovereignty of the Crown. So sorry, it's a bit of a lengthy introduction, but just to give the audience some context for these questions. So the question is, you say that the British assertion of sovereignty was truly astonishing and had almost no credibility in international law. Why do you think that's the case?
Well, firstly, the Uluru Statement, as I mentioned, most of your audience will appreciate, was an extremely important statement. It will no doubt live as one of the great political and constitutional documents in Australian history. There's no doubt about that. both the fact that it brought together so many leading people from all over Australia. After a lot, it is there to remain. No matter what happens with it, it will be one of the great documents. Now, as you said, there are three basic points. One, a voice to Parliament. Now, that is under discussion, as we know. Then the question of truth-telling, and that is clearly something which has been going on, but almost certainly we need to continue with that. And thirdly, and I think in some ways the most challenging proposition, and that is that Indigenous First Nation sovereignty was always there, was not taken, not ceded. Australia was not conquered, and therefore there is a continuation of that sovereignty, and it lives side by side with the sovereignty, as we say, of the Crown. Now, that is challenging because that is not what Australian law says or has ever said. Mm. Australian law still says, as it said at the very beginning, that the First Nations people did not exercise sovereignty over their land. They had no laws and customs, they therefore had no sovereignty. There was no need to sign a treaty, as there was later with the Maori. The sovereignty was not lost as a result of conquest. Because there was no sovereignty, that the British Crown became the original sovereign over the whole continent by 1829. Remember, there were three grabs at sovereignty: 1788, 1824 in the centre, 1829 in the west. So in that period, Britain became the sole sovereign, and therefore no Indigenous sovereignty could have survived. Now, that is still the law, and it has been the law since it's a very important challenge, and probably more important than most people realised when the statement was made.
Okay. Yeah, certainly that resonates with the reasoning of the High Court, that the notion that there's any form of Aboriginal sovereignty is impossible in law to maintain, and that's from the case of Coe. So you say that the British assertion of sovereignty had no credibility in international law. Could you elaborate on that idea a bit, please?
Yes. Well, now, one of the problems in much of this sort of debate and discussion is that people say, well, yes, you might be right, but you are applying the standards of today, the standards of human rights, back into the past, anachronistically, and saying things should have been different. Well, they weren't different, but that's just the way things were done at the time. Now, what I wanted to do is to go beyond, farther back than 1788, and look at what actually was the law as understood in Europe, European international law, and there was a lot of it in the 18th century, and also to consider what the British, the common law, had to say about property rights and things like that, to understand what the situation was when the British arrived. And when the British arrived, there was absolutely nothing in either British law or international law to justify a claim. You see, the British could have arrived and made a small settlement on Sydney Cove and made a claim for a small amount of territory which they occupied. That would have been consonant with international law at the time. If they'd put down their small settlement and said, we have sovereignty now over an area which is drained by the rivers that come into Sydney Harbour, or just, but it would have been recognised by international law. But that isn't what they did. They came and, you know, on the shores of Sydney Cove on the 7th of February, 1788, when they didn't know anything about the vast continent, They claimed sovereignty over half a continent. It was an astonishing claim and had absolutely no justification in the law of the time.
Yeah, thank you. So you also say in your book that recognition of First Nation sovereignty is simply a matter of common sense. As you said, First Nation sovereignty wasn't ceded, there was no conquest. But you also say that common sense is not the same thing as the common law. Could you explain what you mean by that? I like that line.
That's a bit cheeky, isn't it?
Yeah. As a lawyer, I really like that one.
Well, you see, my view is, once again, looking at what the law of the late 18th, early 19th century said about sovereignty, there is no doubt that the individual First Nations, and increasingly we're learning to appreciate that Australia was a mosaic of small self-governing nations. And there is no doubt that they knew, they had a recognisable territory, they knew what it was, they may have had relations, good or bad, with neighbours, but their territory was quite distinct. And they also had laws and customs which they applied to that territory. They therefore were sovereign nations, although small. Now, that puts it in a quite different situation because it presents the problem. If you say, the court may well say no, because there's no sovereignty, they lost it. And as a court, we can't question that because it was done by the Crown. Now that is inexcusable. If you say to the Australian law, if you could speak to the law itself and say, all right then, well now, how did you gain sovereignty? Now, we know you couldn't possibly claim sovereignty over country you had never seen, often didn't see for 100 or more years. How could you claim you exercise sovereignty over it? You have to establish how, bit by bit, you gained the sovereignty that was already there. And it's a very, very difficult task. Not only do you have to say, how did you do it, but when did you do it? Yeah. When did the sovereignty of the individual nations pass from them to the Crown? And in what way? What was the date? And how did it happen? You can see why the courts don't want to undo this, because it is such a complex, difficult problem to show how the sovereignty was taken, but above all, how was it lost and when, and by what means. So that, as I say, is a fundamental problem at the very heart of our law, and is still there. Yeah.
As you say, Aboriginal people would meet the definition of sovereignty in international law, having defined territories, a system of law and government, and also defending their territory from invasion. But the courts say that the Crown's acquisition of sovereignty was an act of state that can't be challenged in the municipal courts. So leaves us with the conundrum of, can the common law adapt to our understandings today of First Nations as sovereign peoples? So in your work, you refer to a number of legal cases from the United States to support your argument that First Nations sovereignty should be recognised. So in the United States, First Nations are recognised as domestic dependent nations, but that isn't the position taken by the common law in Australia. So why do you think the common law took a different trajectory in the United States to the path taken in Australia?
Yes, it's an extremely interesting and important question. And it's one that Australians really didn't quite understand. When people started talking about treaty, the common understanding was, and can't have treaties within your own country, it's impossible. Well, as some people knew at the time, those who had studied law, particularly in Canada or the United States, and most Australian jurists didn't, then there'd been hundreds of treaties. they began the settlement in North America with treaties. Both the Dutch and then the British, they came in and they recognised that the Indians both were in occupation of their country, they were landowners, and they exercised a form of sovereignty. So therefore, you had to either you could declare war on them, and that was a legitimate way to gain sovereignty right up until after the Second World War. But the most common way, indeed, was to sign treaties. Now, the treaties were often disregarded and overridden, but nonetheless, treaty making was the normal way of proceeding in North America. And that was known in 1788 and 1780s. That was known. That had been going on for 100 years. And it continued in both the United States and Canada. And Canada went on signing treaties until the 1920s. And Canada is the best example for us to look at because it is so similar to Australia in so many ways. And yet their treaty-making process began early and goes on. Whereas we simply inherited a legal system which said, no, you don't need to make treaties in Australia because they have nothing to treat with. They are people, they are lawless people. They have nothing to bring to a table. And that in a way was the fundamental flaw. And this was understood at the time by probably the greatest legal political brain of the time, Jeremy Bentham. Jeremy Bentham said at the time, it was at the time when Bennelong had been made any treaties in Australia, and this will be a fundamental flaw, and that is as it was, because without treaties there was no way to resolve the inevitable conflict over land except by violence. There was nothing, you couldn't go out and negotiate as they did throughout much of Canada. You couldn't go and negotiate about use of land because they had nothing to negotiate with. So it was a fundamental flaw which predetermined so much of the violence. In other words, so the British made a complete mess of the settlement of Australia. And not only did they not recognise that there were any rights they had to negotiate about, but they started their settlements in New South Wales and Tasmania with a mainly young male population of people who had been brutalised by the convict system. So surprise, surprise, it ended up a disaster in both of those early colonies.
So it was basically an unofficial conquest, if you look at it that way, in terms of settlers taking the matters into their own hands because the colonial governments hadn't gone through any formal process with First Nations peoples.
No, there was no way in which, you see, let's take the great expansion of Canada across the Western Plains, from the Great Lakes to the Rockies. An area, much colder, but much like North Australia. Now, the Canadian Mounted Police went out and arranged for large meetings, large gatherings, where they agreed upon the terms of which the Indians would accept the coming of the British, of the settlers, and the coming of the railway. And it was done by treaty making. They are called the numbered treaties, and those treaties still exist. Now, that doesn't mean that things didn't go badly wrong in Canada in many ways, but there was almost no violence. Now compare that to North Australia, particularly Queensland, and the contrast is extraordinary. So violence was in a way, predetermined. And the problem, and people say, oh yes, well that's true, but it was conquest, and we were more powerful than they were, and they simply lost their land as a result. And there are a lot of people who say that's the way to solve your problem. We simply conquered it. Well, yes, you can argue that, but you've still got to show how it happened and when. And because we now understand, and in a sense people always understood that there were separate nations, you've got to show how you conquered each of the nations. And conquest, in a way, also you have to have the person who has been conquered accepting that legally and signing a peace treaty that brings the conflict to an end. And if you don't do that, how do you show how Britain conquered Australia? It's not just conquering vast areas of land, it's conquering the separate nations. And that is an incredibly complex story. And there's no doubt that the Australian courts would have no idea how to explain that.
Yeah. Okay, yes, I mean, that's a point that's been made by a number of Aboriginal scholars such as Irene Watson, Phil Falk and Mick Martin, the question of how Aboriginal sovereignty has been lost, apparently, has never been answered in law. So that's a good point. So moving on to truth-telling, why do you think truth-telling is so important?
Well, it brings us in touch. In some ways, I think truth-telling is one of the most important and characteristic features of the world since the Second World War, particularly with the decision after the Second World War to actually bring the Nazi leaders to trial. Whereas Stalin would have, shot 10,000 of them. We know their crimes. They were egregious. They deserve to be executed. The American argument was that, well, yes, we need to establish their guilt, but above all, it's important that the story is told publicly in open court. And in a way that created an atmosphere where all over the world, certainly in the last generation or so, there have been many what are called truth commissions. We probably have heard most about the one in South Africa, but there were numerous in South America and Central America after the end of dictatorship. There have been many in Eastern Europe after the fall of the Soviet Union. There have been, for instance, one in East Timor, so that all over the world there have been formal bodies that allowed people to go before them and tell their story. Now, the results of truth commissions have varied. Some have been very successful and others haven't. But overwhelmingly, the people who had suffered in some way by a previous regime felt it so important that they could go before a public tribunal and tell their story and above all be heard, and that story be recorded for posterity. And so truth commissions of that sort, I think, have been very, very important in a way drawing a line under a previous regime and a very troubled time. Now, we have had two, in effect, truth commissions that have been very specific. One was the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody, and the other was the Human Rights Commission inquiry into the stolen children, bringing them home. But there has been no more general, official public inquiry into the past, a troubled past. Now, there have, of course, been many people who have written history and legal studies that have dealt with this, but it hasn't really been taken up at the highest level. And I think that's why it is important. And it is important because we still live in a way with, we still live in a way with the history that existed for such a long time. And in a sense, one of the people that many of you will know is Russell Ward. He was a very important person in the history of your institution and a great historian, and he was a friend of mine. But when I started teaching Australian history, he was writing things like saying, that Australia, Australia's got one of the most peaceful histories, that we are very slow to kill one another. And another passage when he said, on the Australian frontier, men never had to carry guns. Now, that is astonishing. That is astonishing. And Russell, changed his view. But that represented the history that generations of Australians were brought up with. So it does need the imprimatur, I think, of official bodies. Now, whether it's one national one or state-based ones, I don't. This is brought into the public arena, and people can talk about what had happened to them and their parents, grandparents, and their ancestors, and that is recorded in perpetuity. So yes, I think truth-telling has shown to be important in so many places with troubled histories.
And I would think especially a point important in Australia today, where we are 30 years after the Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody. We still have a huge number of deaths in custody and a number of recommendations not implemented, and the official government response to the Bringing Them Home report under John Howard's coalition government, basically ignoring those recommendations. So obviously still a lot of work to be done. Now, you mentioned some key figures in Australian nation building in your book, including as being implicated in the conquest of the North and complicit in the killing of Aboriginal peoples, effectively turning a blind eye to what was happening. So people such as Sir John Forrest, the great uncle of Andrew Forrest, Sir John Downer, the great grandfather of Alexander Downer, and Sir Samuel Griffiths, one of the founders of the Australian Constitution. Do you think that their close links to the Australian establishment, for want of a better word, means that the political will to engage in truth-telling may be lacking?
Yes, I mean, see, what has struck me, having lived for many, many years in North Australia, was to see Australian history from the north rather than from the south. Now, there's no doubt that there were two eras of colonisation or conquest, whichever word you choose to use. The first was up to about 1850, which was dominated in many ways by, obviously it was a British venture, a British imperial venture system, because the two big colonies were Van Diemen's Land and New South Wales. Now, the second era came after 1850, when the whole of North Australia was it wasn't all occupied, but the conquest of North Australia began. Now, in 1850, there were only 8,000 Europeans in Queensland, 4,000 in Western Australia, and none in the Northern Territory. So the second half of the 19th century saw the conquest of this huge area of subtropical and tropical Australia, but undoubtedly the most heavily populated part of Australia. And in a sense, that is the part which we have to take responsibility for. In the early period, one can indeed, you can blame the British for so much. It was a British imperial venture, and indeed for them we should expect an apology. But after 1850, 1856, 59, when they all became self-governing, except Western Australia, that responsibility rested with the colonial parliaments, increasingly democratically elected, indeed only by men, but among the most democratic constitutions in the world. The responsibility is with the Australians, that is the settlers who had made their home in Australia, and increasingly the native-born Australians. Now, in a sense, it is that era. It's not going back and, worrying about Cook and Phillip and Macquarie and daubing their statues. It's what happened with the conquest of the North by the Australian colonial parliaments. And therefore, those leaders are far more important to us and far more culpable, partly because, indeed, their careers reach into the 20th century. The three chaps you mentioned were all fathers of the Federation. They were important public figures. They still are. Their names are everywhere. They have Canberra suburbs named after them. And yet there has been no real demand that we account for that era rather than the early era. Now, Griffith in particular, because Queensland was undoubtedly the part of Australia which saw the most unrestrained violence. Now, the British, having given power to the colonies, really did stand back. And so all the responsibility rests with the Queensland Parliament. Griffith was an important figure in the 1870s and 1880s at the height of the conquest. He was either Attorney General or Premier, and for much of that time. And this was the time when the Queensland Native Police was creating mayhem right across the north, and Griffith was at the cabinet table. And he, there could be no other story. There can be no other excuse. He was responsible. He was responsible for what undoubtedly were crimes against humanity. That is the extrajudicial killing. Now, many of his less educated colleagues probably thought, well, that's the law. You're allowed to do this. But Griffith was a great jurist. He was a great believer in the common law. He knew, he could not but know that this was extrajudicial killing outside the law. And yet he, becomes the Chief Justice of Queensland. He then becomes, the first, from 1903 to 1919, he is the Chief Justice of the High Court. He also was one of the major figures in drawing up the Constitution. He is absolutely central in our law and our politics. And yet there's no doubt that he has this weight of guilt on his shoulders, the blood on his hands. So what do we do about that? That's one of the things we've really got to talk about.
Thank you. So in your book, you talk about the importance of symbolism and renaming institutions which bear the names of people implicated in colonial violence. Why do you think this is important? And how can we decolonise and reimagine our key institutions in light of what we know about these people?
Yes, as many people will know, this has been happening on a very large scale, particularly in the United States, but also in Canada and Britain. That is the toppling of statues, but the renaming, or if not the renaming, at least the recognition and the coming to terms. Many of the major universities, Princeton University, one of the great intellectual establishments in the English-speaking world. And Woodrow Wilson was the president of Princeton before he became president of the United States. And of course, the man above all who dreamt up the idea of the League of Nations and freedom, self-determination, one of the great figures of 20th century history. Now, Princeton has removed his name from the buildings that have been named after him because when he was at Princeton, he was a Southerner, and when he moved into the White House, he segregated the federal bureaucracy, which had not been segregated. And so it was that, if you like, that racist segregation of the federal government that led Princeton to remove his name. Now, there have been many similar. Harvard took down the plaque of one of the families who were slavers. Many other universities have done something like this. So that the question arises, and I raised this about Griffith University. Now, what stirred me to do this was, in addition, the most recent edition I'd read at the time of Griffith Review, they had a little piece about Griffith inside the front cover, which, set out that he was a great humanist and a great scholar. Now, all this is true, but there was nothing, nothing about the dark side of Griffith's history. So that you have to wonder. And Griffith, after all, the Griffith Review said, we are iconoclastic, we investigate things. The university's Centre for International Law said, we are pioneers of looking at human rights across the world. There seemed to me this absolute gap between the celebration of Griffith himself and what the university is saying about itself. Now, it's not for me outside Queensland now to say what they should do. Maybe they will do nothing. But I also pointed out that the Queenslanders a short time before had changed the name of a hospital. It cost them $500,000 and a good deal of disquiet amongst some people. But if you can change the name of a hospital for what far less serious reasons than the question of Griffith, the question remains there. What do you do about this sort of question in Australia? And it's a matter of serious debate. There are some institutions which indeed have changed things or taken down statues, but others have said, no, we will work through this and we will find ways to come to terms with our past and take action to do better in the future. So it is a live issue, but it's one that has scarcely been discussed in Australia as yet.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you talked before about treaties in the United States, Canada and New Zealand. We now have treaty negotiations going on in Queensland, the Northern Territory and Victoria. Now, the Uluru Statement recommends a Makarrata Commission with the function of overseeing treaty making. Do you think there is a need for an independent arbiter to oversee the interpretation and implementation of treaties, if we go down that path?
Well, I think we have to think very hard about who the treaty is going to be between, where it's, what area of land is going to be dealt with. Now, the Victorians have clearly decided that this is to be a state-based thing. The Victorian government will set up the process to have this process within the boundaries of Victoria. Now, something quite similar, although they didn't use the word treaty, had already taken place in Western Australia with the Great Agreement with the Noongar people, which was a very significant event, but little known outside Western Australia. Now, this raises the question, are the treaties going to be like the modern Canadian treaties, which are treaties about specific areas of land with specific groups? Now, in a sense, that might be the place to look, because the Canadians, having stopped making treaties in, I think, about 1924, started again with the modern treaties in British Columbia and right across the north. And they, as I say, because it is a society very similar to Australia, its institutions and its parliament and its common law, that's where we should begin and look. And it may well be that we'll have treaties in large areas. I mean, for instance, Torres Strait, Cape York, the Gulf country, Arnhem Land, East Kimberley, West Kimberley, etc., etc. Now, that may be the way to go, but whether there's an overarching national thing done by the federal government is something we've got to talk about. And even if we did, I think you'd have to have two. You simply have to have a separate treaty for the Torres Strait and one for the whole of Australia. But given that Australia was a mosaic of small nations, maybe the regional treaties, a mosaic of regional treaties may be the way to go. But, I've got an open mind about this, and I think we have to start talking about this again. We used to talk a lot about Canada and what was happening there, but we've forgotten about what's happening internationally. And I think the Canadian modern treaty-making process is the one that might suit us best.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so just one final question. In your book, you note that there's not universal Indigenous support for the Uluru Statement, but that it is, and I quote, undoubtedly the most widely canvassed document that has ever been addressed to the wider community by representatives of First Nations. So what would you say to First Peoples who are ambivalent or perhaps do not support the Uluru Statement?
Yes, well, this is true. I mean, clearly the Noongar agreement, there were significant groups who were opposed to doing it, and it was fought right up to the High Court. And I think this is simply politics. This is what would happen in any society. And so it's absolutely to be expected that any agreement, as with any land rights agreement, there are going to be people who don't think that it represents their views, who don't want to be part of it. But that is to be discussed and decided within the First Nations communities, almost community by community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay.
And there's nothing that outsiders can do about that.
Thank you. Okay, so Andrew might open it up to some questions from the floor. So if anyone's got questions here, please put up your hand. But I'll just kick off with a question. I've been getting emails from the journalist David Marr during the week. So he's asked me to put a few questions to you. So he says, an odd question perhaps, but would the story have turned out differently if Indigenous Australians wore clothes? Would they then have looked to European eyes more like people who had to be dealt with respectfully? He says, in my reading of early sources lately, I see the word naked everywhere, and nearly always to indicate the savagery of the Indigenous, their wildness, and their inhabiting a world so distant from Europeans. Basically not the sort of people you could treat with. Can you comment on that?
It's an interesting question. I haven't really thought about it before, but I don't think that your sartorial behaviour had any effect on what your legal rights should have been, either in the common law or in international law. I've never read anything in the common law or any of the 19th and 18th century international law discussions about nakedness and about savagery. I mean, I just think that, yes, undoubtedly at the popular level, this fed into this idea that these people were savages, but I don't think that in any way can be an explanation for their fundamental fault from the idea of the British officials who in 1786, knowing nothing about Australia, really sat down to create the law that would be introduced in Australia. Now, one of the critical things was the idea that they were essentially nomadic. They were unsettled. They had never really taken the land out of the common property of humanity and made it their own, if not by using their labour, at least by being settled. Now, that was the overwhelmingly important thing. Now, and the point was that within a very, very short time, and I explain this in the book, within a very, very short time, the first British settlers in Sydney quickly realised that indeed, that although there were these different groups, they had names for themselves, they lived in specific territories, and of course they got to understand that very, very early. And everywhere they moved out into the interior, they found new groups who would live in several areas. Now, the British assumption was that when the British arrived, they would simply move on and go somewhere else because they weren't settled. They weren't attached to the soil. But of course, exactly the opposite happened. People didn't and couldn't go out of their own territory. They stayed as close as they could to their traditional homelands. And that's true all over Australia. So in a sense, it was that idea of being rootlessness and being without any rights because you weren't settled was more important, I think, than other customs.
Yeah. So wearing clothes wasn't an attribute of sovereignty under international law?
No.
No. Okay. Do we have any questions from the floor here? Up the back, Maria, would you like to just get the microphone? Just introduce yourself, please.
Hello, Professor Reynolds. My name's Maria Cotter. I've variously a student of archaeology, Aboriginal archaeology and Australian history, I guess. But one of the things I recollect from one of your earlier books was I thought you mentioned the word the British made a mess of it. I thought you had actually made some intimation that there was some deliberateness, if you like, in that mess making. And to the extent I'm thinking also about what you've just talked about, part of that comes also to the extent of social Darwinism and their belief that they were superior to settlers, in which case the two things I think of is, one, I'd like to understand to what extent you still hold that view of deliberateness, and secondly, if social Darwinism is part of it, then perhaps we also should chuck out Charles Darwin in amongst things.
Yeah, look, social Darwinism obviously can't explain anything about 1788. It certainly was important in 1888, but not in 1788. So that, yes, Darwin, social Darwinism, and I mean, Darwin can't really be blamed for the uses that people put his theories, which were about, about the natural world. Anyway, that's beside the point. One of the points about the British is they knew almost nothing about Australia. And the settlement, they had to do it quickly. They had no intention of doing anything in 1770. I mean, Cook, discovered or was the first, possibly the first European navigator which actually sailed up the east coast. The rest of the continent, of course, had been discovered by the Dutch long, long before. But the British had no particular intention of doing anything about Australia. Remember, he also circumnavigated New Zealand. But it took them 70 years before they decided to conquest, to annex, to settle New Zealand. Now, that may well have been the case with Australia had it not been for the loss of the American colonies, and they suddenly had to find a solution, particularly for their massive population of convicts, of people who've been convicted mainly of theft. So that it was done in a hurry without knowing much about it. But certainly they had this, as I say, it was this view of they didn't, and this was the view they got from Joseph Banks, the great man who had actually been with Cook. And Banks's advice was that, firstly, there were very, very small populations, and they'd only, of course, seen people from the coast. They were obviously nomadic, they would move away. And but also his other advice was probably the most significant, where he said it is very likely, away from the seacoast, Australia is uninhabited. Now, he said this because remember, he was a botanist. He claimed that there was nothing in the Australian environment that you could eat without crops. So if there were no crops at the coast, if there was no gardening, no crops, nothing being cultivated, it's almost certain if there was no cultivation anywhere. And without cultivation, you couldn't have survived in Australia. The people who were in Australia were those who were able to take food from the sea. And so the assumption was that apart from very small population around the seacoast, the rest of the interior was empty. Now, there's no doubt in my mind that that is the assumption that they arrived with. And there's a lot of evidence that I show in the book about how they discovered to their amazement that there were people who lived inland and didn't actually eat fish. Now, this is, as I say, this is partly because they decided to settle Australia knowing almost nothing about it. Whereas the settlement in New Zealand, they knew a lot about it because, you know, it had been visited by Europeans for 70 years. So it's partly the speed and the ignorance that they had about the Australian continent. Mm. And they created a law, which, as I say, we still have to suffer from. And that is the most astonishing thing, I think. That is, we are still beholden to a law that was created by a few British officials on the other side of the world before they knew anything about Australia in a foreign country. And we say, well, we can't do anything about that because that was a decision by the Crown. Now, that is absolutely astonishing. And it indicates how profoundly Australia has failed to decolonise.
Mm. Thank you. Do you have any questions on the live chat, Andrew? Oh, sorry. Was there another one here?
Yes, hello. Thank you for your comments today, Professor Reynolds. I'm Jean Harkins. I'm a linguist. And so my question is a bit language related. It is about the fact that the colonisers called the first peoples Aboriginal, meaning ab meaning from and original meaning beginning. That very word, even though it came to be used as if it was a bad thing, but it in the very word is an acknowledgement that these people were here from the beginning, and a human population in a place from the beginning would be assumed in every way to have sovereignty unless, and this is where the arguments become so forced, that because they didn't grow a certain type of crop a certain way, they didn't have sovereignty, or because they didn't have clothes, they didn't have sovereignty, or because they didn't have written down black letter law, that they didn't have sovereignty. So the in the presence of that word as the original acknowledgement of first people as first people, the arguments against sovereignty seem to look incredibly forced. And I wonder if you think that. I know words have no legal force in themselves, but that seems to be a big one.
Yes, no, look, thank you for those comments. The question about sovereignty is very much, you've got to have sovereignty over a specific territory. Sovereignty relates to territory. You don't carry a specific territory. Now, that's why the idea that they moved about was able to be used to say they didn't have sovereignty. But of course, as the linguists will know more than anyone, the very fact that the languages are distinct right across the continent indicates that people lived on those specific territories for a long time and often had very little interchange because there's not much exchange of words. So that the linguistic history evidence is all important in establishing the long continuity in a specific place, which is the overwhelming of all the things you need to be able to establish for sovereignty, is that you lived in a specific defined place for a long period of time. And that's why the linguistic evidence is all important. Now, there was something else that I may not have addressed. Could you remind me?
Just the fact that the colonisers used that word, that was their acknowledgement of the fact that that population had been there for a very long time. I suppose then again they fudged the specific territory bit by generating this myth of nomadism as aimless wandering. So I think you've nailed the point on which the main point against sovereignty. But again, it seems at variance with the acknowledgement that these people were here from the beginning.
Yeah. Well, it's almost.
And,
go on.
The other point is that you didn't. I mean, the idea that you had to be cultivators to own the land is simply that didn't apply in European law. It hadn't applied in Roman law. The people who lived in a place must be assumed to be in possession. Possession is 9/10 of the law. I mean, that is so old and so part of European law from its very beginning, that the people who lived in a place were assumed to be in occupation. They assumed to have rights. And I mean, that's fundamental to European law. So the idea that somehow there isn't support, in the law as it was, is, as I remarked quite much earlier, is simply not the case. And you didn't have to dig the soil. I mean, so much of Britain had never been dug. There were vast areas of Britain, I mean, that weren't cultivated, and yet, of course, people are in possession. And you could claim your possession by simply using it in a way that the land allowed. And so, hunting grounds could be established. You could establish your possession of hunting grounds by shooting over them once a year. That was in English property law. So that, there's nothing in the law which really allowed them to do what they did in Australia. And in a sense, that part of it was dealt with by Mabo. The court did grasp that question, but sovereignty was clearly, a step much too far. Although, implicitly, Mabo, I mean, the fact that people, they recognised that people lived in distinct communities, and that is the whole basis of the Mabo legislation and the Mabo judgment. It is an implicit recognition of sovereignty. So it is halfway there, but how we move for the other half is a very, very difficult question.
Okay. Thank you. Just going to make the comment, it's like by using that homogenising term Aborigine, it sort of obscured the diversity of language and people and the small nations that are here. Andrew, did you have some questions from the Q&A?
We've got some questions from our online audience, and I'll just mention that we've got over 100 people participating online, so it's fantastic to be able to broadcast the dialogue so wide. Yes. I've got a number of questions from our online audience, some of them a bit long and some short. I'll start with a long one, Professor Reynolds. This one's from Simon Burgess. Hi, I'm most grateful to Professor Reynolds, both for his wonderfully stimulating corpus of work and his time today. I have a somewhat philosophical question that I've long wanted to ask him. I imagine he's quite familiar with Ernest Renan's famous little essay, What is a Nation?, in which he contends that forgetting is a crucial factor in the creation of a nation. Renan even insists that if called upon to choose, a nation should opt for myth, codified in collective memory over history. Reading any number of Australian historians who came before Professor Reynolds, I'm tempted to suppose that they effectively accepted Renan's view, but I'd be interested to hear what Professor Reynolds thinks of this. I'm also interested to know whether in the Australian context he thinks that there could ever come a time when Renan's conviction may be relevant.
Yes, that is an interesting question, and that whole idea that, if I remember rightly, Renan said, nations, it's necessary to get their history wrong. And, you know, one can understand this, but this is in a way, this is a constant in most nation states, a constant between the official story, which is seen as necessary. And John Howard was, you know, probably the person who articulated this most clearly. That is, the black armband history was dangerous because it made young Australians ashamed of their own society, and they would not become patriotic Australians. Now, I understand that argument, but and this is happening in so many parts of the world. It's very, very strong in America now. There are many, many states, the Republican states, which are passing laws about that you can't attack the pioneers. I mean, Texas in particular has passed a law saying you can't attack those heroes who took Texas out, you know, from Mexico, when basically their interest was not freedom but expanding slavery, because Mexico had banned slavery. So this is happening everywhere, and it's happening, you know, in Europe, where they, you know, they deal with, you know, particularly their attitude to, you know, their Jewish citizens, the people who collaborated with the Nazis. There's this ongoing, endless struggle between an official, acceptable view of history and the dissidents who say, no, that's wrong. It wasn't like that. And in a way, that's what makes history such an important and dynamic discipline, because it is obviously changing, and as a result, constantly people find things about it which are disturbing. But what I find most interesting is that we are still, as I pointed out in my last remarks, I think Australia is one of the few countries in the world which did not go through the process of decolonisation. Decolonisation was the greatest of the, you know, from the 20th century, the great movement was not the Great Wars, but the whole process of decolonisation. And in a way, the movement of power and influence away from Europe is an ongoing part of this. Now, Australia, in a way, failed to decolonise. And so, in a way, we still, you see, what three things do we currently most feel we should commemorate? One is Captain Cook's voyage up the East Coast. And remember, we were going to have a very large ceremony, and he was going to circumnavigate the continent, which he didn't do, and the Dutch would have been a bit pissed off about this. The second is Phillip, the arrival of the First Fleet, Australia Day, and the third is Anzac Day, you know, where Australians ran ashore fighting for Britain under British command, pursuing strategic objectives they knew nothing about for Britain. Now, in other words, we are still commemorating the British. Now, I cannot understand why we don't start commemorating our true heroes. That is, the First Nations people who fought for their country, for their mini countries, over a long period of time in impossible circumstances. Why don't we celebrate and commemorate these people? Now, this is starting with the easiest ways we can flip the history from being an imperial history to being a history of our continent.
Should we take one more question? Or how many?
I've got a few more questions. I've got three short ones that I might be able to wrap up in one go and get Professor Reynolds to make a comment to all three. From Kelly Pollard, should truth-telling be mandatory in the school curriculum? And I'll go to another one from Susan Lewis. Statues are a powerful presence in tourism, community events, school excursions, and so on. Rather than rip down statues of the bad guys, I believe we could add to the story by including statues of family groups and Aboriginal and Islander leaders strategically placed near these colonisers' statues to reflect the contrast and drive more conversation. Any thoughts on this? And I'll give one more just to round out the conversation from Faye Haywood. What role do you believe commemoration takes in the facilitation of truth-telling and change?
Yes, they're interesting, and they do sort of fit together nicely. Well, I'm in favour of commemoration, both commemoration in the sense of events, but also in putting the marks on the soil, and in a way that's why your monument is so important as pointing the way to the future. And I think we need on the ground, we need, signs which say whose country this was, all over the continent. I think we need commemorations about the conflict to be determined in the communities, the various communities. And we may indeed end up with as many commemorations about the conflict for Australia as we have of the war memorials about our fighting outside Australia. So that, yes, I believe in commemoration. And then the other question was, yes, I'm not in favour of pulling statues down, because then they're just forgotten. You take them out of the historic memory. Where significant, I think there should be indeed reinterpretation. And this has happened in a few places where you can, each generation should be allowed to add their view on a statue. This can be easily done. And, we may think that our view is the one that will last forever, but that's what the original statue makers thought. So that I think there must be a continuing reinterpretation. And what is more, it would make many of these statues much more interesting, and people would actually look at them and read them, which by and large they don't. So yes, statues need a lot of reinterpretation rather than being pulled down.
Any thoughts on the curriculum question, Professor?
On the curriculum question. Well, I think that the difficulty is, you've got to think, where is this to be done? Well, clearly it had become state education departments who would need to, say what had to be taught. But this still wouldn't take in a third of the children who go to the Catholic or the independent schools. So it is a long and slow process, and I don't think it can be easily done simply by fiat. But there are significant changes going on. I know they're completely rechanging the curriculum for middle school in Tasmania. The significant change in Queensland, the New South Wales Catholic system is changing. It is happening, but I think if you say that all people have got to have a particular sort of history, you will simply get a great deal of resistance. Children are very sensitive to the idea that you are imposing something on them. You've got to be, as I've spent many, many years teaching, you have to do it reasonably carefully. And I don't think teachers should pontificate. I think they should encourage kids to think for themselves. But yes, in general terms, yes, of course, the curriculum has to be developed. And there's been a controversy recently with the talk about the national curriculum, and already strong resistance. It once again becomes part of the culture wars. So yes, we must go on. We must develop the way we teach our history, but it's got to happen bit by bit, place by place, rather than coming down from above.
There's a couple of more questions, but maybe we're out of time.
Maybe one last question.
One last question from the online audience. This is a question from Bryce Wilson. Hi, Henry. What are your views on Michael Mansell's proposal on the seventh state instead of numerous treaties, given the issues with treaties and power imbalances between government and communities, nations?
Well, I think that, you know, that would be very difficult to do, and I think would be met with enormous hostility. My great preference, as I say, is to go to the Canadian model and to establish, and the Canadians, remember, have gone so far in Nunavut to actually have a new province, a self-governing province. Mm. The Canadian regional treaties are based, I mean, they negotiate directly with the federal government on the basis of state to state, because there is still the recognition that there is a form of sovereignty. And this is the way the negotiation proceeds. And part of the negotiation is for internal self-government, and that there is a inherent right to self-government, as well as discussions about resources, return of land, payment of compensation and reparation. All of these things can be wrapped into these, and I just think this would be much easier to do. And I think there are places in Australia where people are moving in this direction. I believe Cape York is looking at this, and I'm sure the Torres Strait would jump at this. And I just think this is a much easier thing to do than to try and create some state which wouldn't have the, what would be its territory? It'd be, a mosaic of little bits of land. And I don't think that's the basis on which, I think it's got to be, the territory has got to relate to the original mosaic of sovereign states. And that's where you start from. And you find areas where there is enough common cultural compatibility to bring those groups together to negotiate. It'll be largely the state governments, as happened in southwest of Western Australia, after all, a very large area.
Okay, thank you. Well, we probably should wrap up our questions for now. We're going to do some formal thank yous, but I'd just like to personally say thank you to you, Professor Reynolds. It's been wonderful speaking with you today. And it's an honour and a privilege. And I'd like to think that you're going to be on the right side of history in the fullness of time. So thank you very much. If I could just call upon Professor Michael Adams, the Head of School of Law, to do some official thank yous on behalf of the organisers. Thank you.
Well, first of all, Professor Henry Reynolds, you have really engaged us. I have to say, I do love the phrase when you said common sense, not the same as the common law. I think that'll go into all our lecture notes for everyone, etc. The Uluru Statement has still such a significance, and I don't know about you, but the frustration of the snail's pace of change. But let's, as the previous statement Marcelle said, you'll be on the right side of history. The truth-telling and reconciliation you, through your book and through your presentation today, is a really valuable insight. And I don't know about you, the online audience and our physical audience, lots of ideas are buzzing around my head, and I'm sure we will talk for much more. On behalf, so thank you, Henry. We very much appreciate your time this afternoon. It's a shame you weren't able to travel with us today from Tasmania, and we look forward to seeing you at some future time in person. as you can imagine, an organisation like this, to put on an event only happens through collaboration. And as such, is really, I think, beautiful. We've been able to bring together the Friends of the Mile Creek Memorial, both the Armidale Fellows and Friends, as well as the national body, as well as the School of Law. And of course, here we are in the Urala Aboriginal Centre. More specifically, some individuals have been the driving force, starting, of course, with Uncle Steve Waters at the beginning, Marcelle, one of my colleagues, and Andrew Lawson, which we're very grateful, and Associate Professor Guy Charlton, who heads the First People's Rights and Law Centre at the Law School. We're also very grateful to Julie Collins and Donna Moody, Robert Vidler, and Maxine Ross and Adam Blakester, all under the auspice of the Miles Creek Memorial. At a national level, right at the beginning, Marcelle mentioned Keith Munro and Ivan Roberts as co-chairs have been great supporters, as with Dr. Anne Daly and Joe Hopwood-Miller, Cecilia Blackwell as well. So it's lovely to bring all those things together. Within the School of Law, our professional team of Anna Law, Sue Joel, Blend Eastgate, and then some academics, particularly Dr. Guy Charlton of the First Peoples, who did send his apology today. And then lastly, within the Urala Aboriginal Centre, well, Guido, of course, Tess, and the whole Urala staff work together. Julie, I think you're going to come and say some additional thank yous on behalf of the university, but really on behalf of us all here, thank you, Professor Reynolds. We really appreciated your time and effort. What a great event. Thank you.
Readers Companion. Give it a plug.
Yeah. I'm actually doing a thank you on behalf of the Friends of Mile Creek. So yes, we'd really like to thank you, Professor Henry Reynolds, for your very thought-provoking responses. I'm sure we'll be having long chats about everything you've said going into the future. I'd also like to thank Marcelle for her very insightful questions, and I should come over here because you won't be able to hear me, and to everybody online and here in this room for your questions and input also. I'd like to thank Uncle Steve for his eloquent welcome to country. That was very inspiring and made us, I think we all did feel very welcome. Thank you to the university for supporting this event, especially the Vice-Chancellor, Bridget Haywood, the School of Law, and the Urala Centre for hosting this event today. The Friends of Mile Creek really values this collaborative relationship with the university and hope this can continue in the future. Perhaps we could have an annual yarning event. I think that would be really good. And I thank you, Henry, for suggesting that it is a yarn, because I think that is entirely appropriate with the type of event that we would like to promote rather than just a lecture. So we'd also like to, obviously this yarning event would coincide with the memorial ceremony, which is going to happen this weekend. And I'm just thinking about Australia not having decolonised. It always takes place on the Queen's birthday. Well, long weekend, but we're very grateful for the long weekend. So we'd like to invite you all, everybody here and everybody online, to attend this weekend's ceremony. Oh, and before I go on to the ceremony, this is Henry's latest book, and when we were going to have a big event, the Reader's Companion ordered in lots and lots of copies of this. So if anybody locally is thinking of getting a copy, we'd really like it if you supported Reader's Companion.
Okay, so perhaps we could all just join together and thank Professor Reynolds in the usual way. Thank you very much for your time, and we hope we see you at Mile Creek in 2022, perhaps. Yep.
Well, thank you for that. I mean, I think it's wonderful what has happened there. I mean, Mile Creek has got two lessons for us. The first was the terrible lesson of a real massacre, that is, people who presented no threat simply killed and then the failure of the British attempt to impose the law. And it was a terrible failure, as we know. It affected the rest of Australia for the, well into the 20th century. But then this amazing community of coming together and commemorating the event, which really is an example to the rest of Australia of what can be done and what needs to be done. And therefore, I think Myall Creek now is a beacon to light our way forward, rather than a word and a place for us to lament about.
Thank you, everyone.